As Maya stepped out of the courtroom, she tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that lingered from her brief interaction with Judge Miller. The fine was a small inconvenience in the grand scheme of things, but something about the way he looked at her made the whole situation feel weightier than it should have. She had faced tougher challenges in her career. Missions in volatile regions, navigating the politics of military leadership, and advocating for change in an institution not always open to it. But this had been different. She could sense that the judge had been puzzled by her presence. Maya was used to being the only black woman in many spaces, especially leadership roles, but the courtroom was a place where her uniform felt like an outsider. The judge, while professional, seemed to carry an underlying curiosity. It wasn't the curiosity of someone who simply saw her as a person before the law. No, it was as though he was trying to figure out her story based solely on her uniform and rank. She'd encountered similar looks throughout her career. Looks that didn't quite match the respect she'd earned, but rather seemed to focus on her gender and race before anything else. As she walked down the courthouse steps, Maya's thoughts drifted to the many moments in her career when she had been underestimated. She had spent over a decade fighting to prove that her identity wasn't a limitation, but a strength. The military had its own way of testing people, pushing them to their limits, and she had always risen to the occasion. But it wasn't always easy. There were countless times when she had to work twice as hard, when her contributions were questioned, or when her ideas were dismissed simply because of how she looked. Yet every time she proved herself, she became more determined to create an environment where the next generation of soldiers wouldn't have to face the same barriers. Maya reached her car and paused, taking a deep breath. The sun was bright, the air crisp. A small part of her wanted to brush off the encounter, to treat it like any other mundane moment in a busy day. But another part of her couldn't help but wonder if there was more at play. Why had Judge Miller acted the way he did? She was no stranger to the skepticism that came with being a trailblazer in a male-dominated, predominantly white institution. But she had also learned that there was power in turning such moments into opportunities for growth. Just as she slid into her car, her phone buzzed with a text from a fellow officer. The work never stopped, and Maya knew that the next challenge was already waiting for her. But something told her that the brief encounter with the judge wouldn't be easily forgotten. Whether she liked it or not, their paths had crossed for a reason. And she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. Judge Robert Miller sat at his desk long after the courtroom had emptied, staring at his notes from the morning's cases. He had been a judge for nearly 20 years and had seen all types of people, from hardened criminals to law-abiding citizens, with rare lapses in judgment. But something about Lieutenant Colonel Maya Simmons had unsettled him. The way she held herself with quiet authority, her eyes steady and confident despite the minor infraction she was facing, it wasn't what he expected. He'd dealt with officers before, of course, but there was something different about her. As soon as he called her name and saw her standing there in full uniform, he couldn't help but notice the contrast. Here was a woman who, despite her rank, still seemed like an outsider in a courtroom full of civilians. She carried herself with a military precision that seemed to disrupt the usual flow of the court. For a moment, he felt as though the courtroom, usually filled with mundane cases, was not quite large enough for someone like her. It wasn't just her rank that had caught his attention. It was her presence. Maya had spoken with clarity, no defensiveness, and no sense of entitlement, but something in the judge's mind stirred as he listened to her explanation. "I was rushing to meet a deadline," she had said so matter-of-factly, as if it were just another task in her endless list of responsibilities. But the fine he'd imposed, while fitting, felt too simple, too direct. He had assumed that her situation was nothing more than a typical case of speeding, but there was a part of him that now wondered if he had misjudged her. After the session, he found himself unable to let go of the thought. Why had he been so quick to assess her? He couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to this woman than just a soldier on a routine errand. His curiosity grew, compelling him to look deeper. At home that evening, after a long day of legal proceedings, Judge Miller sat at his desk and began to search for information about Maya. It wasn't something he did often, researching those who appeared before him, but something about this case seemed different. A quick search on his computer revealed Lieutenant Colonel Maya Simmons' military career, a list of achievements and accolades that painted a picture of someone much more than a woman in uniform who had been late to a meeting. She had spent years working with soldiers from diverse backgrounds, and as part of the Army's diversity initiative, she had been instrumental in pushing for systemic changes to improve support for Black service members. As he read through the articles, interviews, and citations, Miller was struck by the breadth of her work. She was a leader, yes, but she was also a voice for those who often went unheard. He had seen the challenges in his own courtroom, the inequities that persisted, the biases that crept in, and suddenly it became clear to him. Maya Simmons wasn't just a soldier. She was part of a larger movement that was slowly transforming institutions, one decision at a time. Miller closed his laptop with a sigh, the weight of his realization settling in. The woman he had so quickly judged as just another motorist was someone shaping the future in ways he hadn't even considered. He wondered if he had made a mistake by not engaging with her differently. Had he missed an opportunity? Maya Simmons had never intended to make history. When she joined the U.S. Army as a young woman straight out of college, her goal had been simple: to serve her country and make a difference. But the Army, like any institution, had its own expectations. Expectations that often seemed at odds with who she was. Raised in a modest neighborhood, Maya had always been determined to succeed. She was no stranger to challenges. Her family had instilled in her a work ethic that could move mountains, and her drive was matched only by her resolve to never let anyone else define her path. Her first days in the Army were a blur of physical training and drills, a whirlwind of tests that felt designed to weed out the weak. Maya had learned quickly that being one of the few women in a male-dominated space wasn't the hardest part. It was being one of the few Black women that posed the greater challenge. There were whispers behind her back, subtle remarks that made her question whether her place in the Army was as secure as she'd hoped. But Maya had a choice. She could either accept the limitations imposed on her or fight to break through them. The Army wasn't going to give her any handouts. Maya was constantly tested, not only on her physical abilities, but on her leadership, her resolve, and her capacity to lead with integrity. She was assigned to a small unit in the early years of her service, and while she faced skepticism from some of her fellow officers, there were others who saw her potential. Slowly, she gained respect from her peers and subordinates alike. They saw her not just as a soldier, but as someone who was willing to stand up for what was right, even when it meant going against the grain. As Maya's career progressed, she found herself drawn into roles that required more than just military expertise. She began advocating for soldiers from underrepresented groups, particularly Black service members who faced unique challenges within the military. While the Army had made strides in improving diversity, systemic issues still existed. There were gaps in support, opportunities were often unequal, and far too many soldiers of color found themselves overlooked when it came to promotions or leadership roles. Maya knew that if she was going to make a real difference, she would have to go beyond just excelling in her own work. She took on leadership positions where she could influence change on a broader scale. She pushed for mentorship programs specifically designed for minority soldiers, so they wouldn't feel isolated or unsupported. She worked tirelessly to develop initiatives that would allow soldiers to thrive in an environment where they had historically been marginalized. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed. Over the years, she was selected for increasingly important roles. She was trusted with projects that focused on diversity and inclusion, helping to reshape the way the Army recruited, trained, and promoted soldiers from all backgrounds. Her efforts weren't always welcomed. There were certainly those who resisted the changes she fought for, but Maya had long since learned how to deal with opposition. She believed in the work, and that belief kept her going, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against her. But despite the progress she had made, there was still a long way to go. Maya knew that systemic change in the Army would take time. However, she remained determined. Every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. For Maya, it wasn't just about breaking barriers for herself. It was about making sure that the next generation of soldiers would never face the same obstacles she had. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a voice for change. And that's what kept her moving forward. Judge Robert Miller couldn't get Maya Simmons out of his mind. What should have been a straightforward case, an officer paying a speeding fine, had turned into something far more complex in his mind. He had seen dozens of cases like it over the years, people speeding, pleading for leniency, or explaining their circumstances. But there was something about Maya, something about her presence in the courtroom, that stayed with him long after the case was over. Her composure, the calm confidence in her voice, and the way she had addressed him, all seemed to suggest that there was far more to her story than a simple traffic violation. Judge Miller, accustomed to dealing with the legalities of the courtroom, found himself pondering the broader implications of the encounter. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had misjudged Maya, that his initial perception of her, based on nothing more than a quick glance and the uniform she wore, was flawed. It wasn't just about the fine or the fact that she was a military officer. It was the realization that he had made assumptions about her, assumptions that, upon further reflection, seemed unfair. That night, unable to let go of the lingering feeling, Judge Miller sat down at his desk, his hands hovering over his laptop. He wasn't one to indulge in personal curiosities about the people who appeared before him, but this was different. He had an unsettling sense that he hadn't seen the full picture. He typed Maya's name into the search engine, expecting the usual military service records, but what he found was a far more detailed and impressive story. As he read, the scope of Maya's work became clear. She was not just another officer in the Army. She was an advocate for systemic change, someone who had worked tirelessly to address the inequities and challenges faced by minority soldiers. Over the years, she had helped to spearhead initiatives aimed at improving diversity and inclusion, ensuring that soldiers of all backgrounds had equal opportunities to succeed. She had been involved in creating mentorship programs, training officers on cultural competency, and pushing for reforms in how soldiers from underrepresented groups were treated and promoted. The more Judge Miller read, the more he felt a growing sense of respect for Maya. She had risen to a position of leadership, not just through her competence as a soldier, but by using her influence to make the Army a more just and inclusive institution. Her work wasn't just important for the Army. It was important for society as a whole. The impact of her efforts reached far beyond the military, affecting how diversity and fairness were viewed across public service sectors. He was struck by how much he had missed in his brief, impersonal exchange with her. Here he had a woman, a leader, who had spent years working to right the wrongs that so many others overlooked, and he had barely acknowledged her contributions. He had let his initial assumptions, his biases, cloud his judgment. The fine he had imposed on her suddenly felt trivial, almost irrelevant in comparison to the larger, more meaningful work she was doing. Judge Miller leaned back in his chair, a sense of guilt settling over him. He wondered if he had failed to see her for who she truly was. In that moment, he realized that there was far more to justice than what played out in his courtroom. Had I given her the respect she deserved? He wondered. Had I taken the time to understand her, or had I merely judged her by what I saw in front of me? The answer, he knew, was painfully clear. He hadn't. But it wasn't too late. Maybe there was a way to make things right. Maya Simmons knew that true leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about making a lasting impact. For years, she had dedicated herself to more than just her own career advancement. She had invested her energy in changing the very fabric of the Army, advocating for policies that would uplift the voices of underrepresented soldiers. Her journey had led her to a pivotal role on the Army's Justice Reform Task Force, where she worked alongside senior officers and military personnel to address the systemic gaps in the military's justice system. The role was a natural progression for her, a culmination of years spent fighting to ensure equal treatment for every soldier, regardless of their background. In her position, Maya had become a central figure in pushing for meaningful change. Soldiers of color, particularly black service members, often faced unequal treatment within military tribunals and disciplinary systems. Disparities in sentencing, inconsistent access to legal counsel, and a lack of proper support for soldiers who faced racial bias were just a few of the challenges that Maya sought to address. She had seen too many instances where soldiers, deserving of fair treatment, were given harsh penalties simply because of the way they looked or where they came from. Her mission was clear: to create a justice system within the Army that was impartial and equitable for all its members, no matter their race, gender, or rank. This meant working not only to reform how cases were handled, but also to educate both military leaders and soldiers on the importance of understanding bias, both unconscious and explicit. Maya knew that lasting change would only come when the Army's leadership acknowledged the problem and worked together to dismantle the structures that upheld it. One of her most important projects was a mentorship initiative that paired young, minority soldiers with seasoned leaders. These mentorships weren't just about career advancement. They focused on navigating the complexities of military law, offering guidance on how to handle disciplinary actions and how to advocate for oneself in a system that often overlooked them. Maya had seen firsthand how minority soldiers were more likely to fall through the cracks when it came to legal matters, and this initiative aimed to ensure that they had advocates in their corner. Another key aspect of her work involved revising the Army's legal training programs. Maya worked with legal experts to design training sessions for military judges, defense attorneys, and officers that focused on recognizing and combating racial and gender biases within the justice system. She understood that bias wasn't always deliberate, but it was pervasive, and if not addressed, it would continue to harm soldiers who were already at a disadvantage. While some of her colleagues were resistant to these changes, Maya's resolve never wavered. She knew that real progress often came with pushback, but she also knew that the work she was doing would have a lasting impact. She had seen the transformation that could happen when soldiers felt heard and seen, and she wasn't about to stop until that same transformation was possible for everyone in the Army. And yet, as committed as Maya was to her work, she couldn't ignore the quiet but growing realization that her journey had only just begun. The Army was changing, but the world outside of it was changing too. The justice system, both in and outside the military, needed reform on a much larger scale. Maya had always believed in the power of one person to make a difference, but she was beginning to understand that she might need allies beyond the walls of the military if she was going to create the change she dreamed of. It was at this crossroads that Maya began to think back on her brief encounter with Judge Miller. The thought had crossed her mind several times since their meeting, lingering in her consciousness like a quiet question. Could someone like him, someone from the civilian justice system, be an ally in her work? She had no answers yet, but one thing was clear: Maya Simmons wasn't one to shy away from possibilities. The work was bigger than any one person, and she was ready to see where this journey might take her. A few days had passed since Judge Robert Miller had first looked up Maya Simmons' name and discovered the depth of her contributions. Despite the flood of realizations that had come with his research, something inside him nagged at him, urging him to reach out. The weight of his mistake hung over him like a shadow, and he knew that simply recognizing his misjudgment wasn't enough. He had to do something to make it right. Late one evening, as he sat in his study, Judge Miller found himself composing a letter to Maya. It wasn't a formal letter of apology, but rather an honest reflection of what he had learned and how it had changed his perspective. He hesitated for a moment before he hit send, unsure of how his message would be received. What did he really know about Maya? He had met her only briefly in a courtroom, and yet now he felt as though he owed her an apology. An apology not just for the fine, but for the assumptions he had made. He wrote, "Dear Lieutenant Colonel Simmons, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is Judge Robert Miller, and you might recall that you appeared before me in court a few days ago regarding a speeding matter. I must admit, the brief interaction we had has stayed with me more than I expected, and I find myself compelled to reach out. After our brief meeting, I took the opportunity to learn more about you. What I discovered, however, was far more than I had anticipated. I've read about the work you've done within the Army, your leadership in justice reform, your advocacy for underrepresented soldiers, and your tireless efforts to make the military a more inclusive and equitable institution. I have to admit, I feel a deep sense of respect and admiration for the work you've done, and I regret that I did not fully appreciate the depth of your contributions when I met you. I also must apologize for my initial actions in court. It was clear that I allowed preconceived notions to shape my judgment, and I failed to recognize the significance of who you are beyond the uniform. I now realize that this wasn't just a case about speeding. It was an opportunity for me to engage with someone who is changing the world in ways I had not fully understood. I sincerely hope that you can forgive me for my lapse in judgment. If you are open to it, I would welcome the opportunity to meet with you and discuss how I might be of assistance in your work. I have seen firsthand how important justice is, and I am eager to understand how I can contribute, in whatever way possible, to the cause you are so dedicated to. Thank you for your time and for everything you are doing. I look forward to hearing from you. Warm regards, Judge Robert Miller. Judge Miller sat back, rereading the letter a few times. He wasn't sure what kind of response, if any, he would receive. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't undo his actions. But perhaps, just perhaps, this letter might be the first step toward bridging the gap between them. Maya, for her part, had been caught off guard when the letter arrived. It wasn't every day that someone, let alone a judge, would take the time to write an apology. At first, she wasn't sure what to make of it. She had expected the usual formalities from people in positions of power, but this felt different. It felt personal. As she read the letter, a mixture of surprise and curiosity washed over her. She could sense the sincerity in his words, and as much as she had initially dismissed the judge's actions in court as a small, inconsequential moment, she now realized that his recognition of his own shortcomings could lead to something much larger. Maya placed the letter down, her mind racing. She wasn't sure yet what this would mean for her work, or if she should respond, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just about a speeding ticket. It was about a larger conversation, one that had the potential to shape both her path and the future of justice reform in ways she hadn't imagined. Maya sat at her desk, the letter from Judge Miller still lying in front of her. She hadn't expected an apology, let alone one that was so thoughtful and sincere. After a moment of contemplation, she picked up the letter again and read it for the third time. Judge Miller's willingness to acknowledge his mistake wasn't something she had anticipated. In fact, she couldn't remember the last time someone in such a position of power had done so without any hint of defensiveness or ego. Her first instinct had been to dismiss the letter. After all, the fine she had received wasn't something that had kept her up at night. It was a minor incident, and there were far bigger battles to fight. But as she reflected on the deeper meaning of his words, she realized that this wasn't just about a small mistake anymore. It was an opportunity to engage with someone who, despite initial biases, was willing to reconsider his views. And that, Maya knew, was rare. She decided to respond. Her letter wasn't formal, nor was it filled with the typical politeness that her role as a leader often demanded. It was candid, and she hoped it would open the door to a real conversation. Dear Judge Miller, thank you for your letter. I admit, I didn't expect to receive a response, much less one that was as thoughtful and reflective as yours. I also appreciate your willingness to acknowledge what I'm sure wasn't an easy thing to do. Most people in your position would have left the situation as it was, but you took the time to dig deeper, and for that, I am grateful. I'm not going to lie and say that I wasn't initially surprised by your actions in the courtroom, but reading your letter has made me reconsider that moment entirely. What I had viewed as a simple interaction now feels more like a defining one, not because of the fine, but because of the way you're now choosing to engage with the broader issues at play. There's much more happening beneath the surface, and I believe we both know it. The work I do in the Army, fighting for justice reform, advocating for soldiers who are too often overlooked. is challenging, and it's not something that's accomplished in isolation. Every day, I see the consequences of systemic biases, not just within our military, but in the larger systems that shape our society. I've often felt like I'm working against a tide, trying to shift institutional mindsets and practices that have been in place for decades. That being said, your letter has made me think about something important. Change doesn't happen when we simply point out flaws from our own corners. It happens when we recognize shared goals and work together to bridge the divides between us. I've spent my career pushing for change from within the Army, but I know that real reform requires allies, even those who come from outside our world. So yes, I'd be open to meeting with you to discuss how we might work together, perhaps not just in the military sphere, but in broader conversations about justice and reform. Let me know when would be a good time for us to connect. I'm intrigued to see where this conversation could take us. Sincerely, Lieutenant Colonel Maya Simmons. Maya hit send, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. She had no idea where this exchange might lead, but there was something powerful about stepping outside the typical boundaries of her work to engage with someone from a different space. This wasn't just about transforming the Army. It was about finding ways to create meaningful change in the wider systems of justice that affected everyone. And now, perhaps, she had an unlikely ally in that fight. Judge Miller didn't know it yet, but the conversation they were about to have could very well mark the beginning of a new chapter in his own understanding of justice. Maya, for her part, was more than willing to explore where this partnership could go. A week later, Judge Robert Miller found himself waiting outside a small cafe in downtown Washington, D.C. He had received Maya's letter in response, and to his surprise, she had agreed to meet in person. The feeling of nervous anticipation he had never expected to feel, especially not after their brief interaction in the courtroom, was now undeniable. He had spent the past several days thinking about how to approach their meeting, how to listen more than he spoke, and how to express his genuine desire to help. Maya wasn't just an officer or an advocate for change. She was a symbol of what the military, and society at large, could become if given the chance to evolve. When Maya walked through the door, there was no fanfare. She wasn't wearing her uniform today, but her presence still commanded attention. She exuded confidence and purpose, traits that Miller had already recognized in their earlier interaction. She made her way toward him with a firm handshake and a smile that was professional but also warm, as if this conversation was something she had been waiting for as much as he had. "Judge Miller, it's good to finally meet you in person," Maya said, taking the seat across from him. There was no animosity in her tone, no sense of formality, just the quiet professionalism that came from someone who had learned to navigate spaces where they weren't always welcome. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Miller replied, still feeling a bit out of his depth, but determined to make the most of the opportunity. He paused before continuing. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on our encounter in court, and I feel I owe you an apology. Not just for the fine, but for not understanding the full scope of your work when we first met. I didn't see you for who you are, and I regret that." Maya listened quietly, nodding thoughtfully. She appreciated the honesty in his words, but she was more interested in what came next. She'd seen enough of the world to understand that apologies, while important, were only meaningful when they led to action. "Apologies are important," she said, "but what matters more is what we do after recognizing our mistakes." Judge Miller nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that told her he understood. "I'm eager to learn," he said. "I've spent my career in the courtroom, upholding the law, but I realize now that justice isn't just about rules and regulations. It's about understanding the human experience, particularly the experiences of those who don't always have a seat at the table." Maya smiled, leaning in slightly. "That's exactly what I've been working toward. The law doesn't exist in a vacuum. The systems we rely on have their flaws, and it's up to people like you and me, to try to fix them." They spent the next several hours talking about their shared vision for justice reform. Maya spoke about her work with the Army, the challenges soldiers of color faced, and the changes she believed were essential for a more inclusive and fair military. Judge Miller shared his experiences on the bench, his growing realization that racial and gender biases had seeped into the civilian justice system in ways he had never fully recognized. He spoke about his desire to be part of the solution, but he also acknowledged how difficult that path could be for someone in his position. By the end of their meeting, both of them felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about personal growth or one isolated issue. It was about an ongoing dialogue between two people from different worlds, both committed to creating systemic change. They agreed to continue their conversations, bringing together their networks and expertise to forge a path forward that blended military and civilian justice reform. As they parted ways that afternoon, there was no grand promise, no bold declarations, just the shared understanding that they were beginning something important. For Maya, it was a partnership born from an unexpected connection. For Judge Miller, it was a chance to do more than just sit in judgment of others. It was an opportunity to be an active participant in the evolution of justice itself. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, both of them knew that they were embarking on a journey that would change not only their careers, but the future of justice for countless others. Together, they would bridge the gaps, challenge the status quo, and build a future where justice was not just a concept, but a reality for everyone, regardless of their background.